My number 5 best chess game of the 1930s is FM Korchmar vs. FC Poliak from the Ukrainian Championship of 1937. Now, this is in fact the only game that survives from Korchmar's career that he won. However, what a game. This game has been called the Ukrainian Immortal for reasons that will be very, very clear as soon as you see the finishing moves to this game. Now, Korchmar was 3 times champion of Odessa, and he's also survived by a grandson who is currently an international master. The opening phase of this game is a little bit curious, and we'll point out some improvements, but it's really not the crux of this game. We see e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ori Lopez, and now pawn to d6, which is a little bit passive, and now pawn to d4. At this point, black should really be making the capture here on d4, in this position or in many of the positions that are coming up. In those kinds of positions, white is a little bit better, but black has a very viable game. Instead, though, black plays the move bishop d7, and white should now be looking to secure the center and prevent this option in future. For example, pawn c3 gives white a very, very nice advantage. Instead, though, white plays knight c3, developing the knight, which I love developing pieces, but we are blocking this very useful c-pawn. Knight to f6, again, not capturing on d4, and probably the best way to get an advantage here is to trade on c6, so that if black makes the capture on d4 later, white is going to keep more pieces on the board. Instead, though, white castles in this position, and now black really needs to make the capture on d4 in this final opportunity that is available. After pawn takes d4, knight takes, and bishop e7, the tension here along this line is likely to lead to some exchanges that are going to give black a relatively decent game. A bit worse, but playable. Instead, though, black plays knight takes d4, and this does lead to an exchange of some minor pieces, but the result, bishop takes d7, queen takes, knight takes, pawn takes, and then queen takes, is very, very favorable to white. Even though we do have 2 minor pieces off the board for each side, white's space advantage still matters here, and white's monstrous queen that is not easily chased away on d4 here is really helping secure a fairly large advantage. So from here we get bishop e7, rook d1, thinking about pawn to e5, and black says, go for it. I'm just going to castle, and white says, all right, I'm going for it, pawn to e5, and now the knight pulls back. Of course, you can't capture here because d7 is losing. You're losing d7, so knight back to e8, defending this d6 point fairly passively, but really committing to that defense and saying, all right, I'm just going to hold that point, and if I hold it, I guess I'll be okay. So bishop f4 developing and putting more pressure right here. Pawn to a5, a somewhat unnatural move, but there's not really a good option available to black. This move intends rook a6, adding more defense along the 6th rank to the pawn on d6. Rook d3, excellent move. From this point forward, we're just going to see excellent moves from white. The rook lift here adds the possibility of the other rook coming to double on the d file, which is great. The other rook also has the ability to go to e1, which happens in the game, and you're adding ideas like rook g3. So rook a6, going for that sideways defense of the d6 pawn that we mentioned. Rook e1 now. And after rook e1, which introduces all kinds of great ideas that pressure this pawn on e7, for example, we see queen to f5. Knight d5, which threatens to capture the bishop here with a royal fork. That would certainly win a lot of material. So the bishop pulls back to d8 here. And now pawn takes d6, opening up the e-file. Knight takes d6, rook g3, big threat of checkmate right here, and pawn to f6. Now, bishop h6 threatens the g7 pawn, so black has to play rook f7. And this brings us to the critical point in this game. Black has been under pressure for a while, but it is now time to deliver a finishing blow in this position. I definitely recommend pausing your video to see if you can find the right idea. Well, white played knight b4, and this move is crushing and, of course, very, very beautiful. And if you're going to see this thing through to the end, you have to see a number of deep moves, but even if you don't see all the moves that eventually culminate in basically checkmate, you can still find each correct move along the way, and it's still going to be the strongest available move. So after knight b4, the rook is under attack, and black basically just needs to play a defensive move like queen d7 and give up the rook if you're going to try to fight on, but of course that's hopeless for black. So pawn takes b4, capturing the knight, and the whole point is that this knight is defending the e8 square. So queen takes d6. Knight b4 is entirely intended as a clearance sacrifice to sacrifice the queen. Beautiful stuff. You can't recapture the queen here, okay? If rook takes d6, then there is rook to e8 check, rook f8, rook takes g7 because the rook that was defending here had to step back to block the check, king h8, and rook takes f8, checkmate. Really, really beautiful. But after queen takes d6, things are not entirely over because you don't have to capture the queen here, but you must defend against rook e8 check. So queen to d7, offering a queen trade and defending the e8 square. Again, I encourage you to pause your video here to find the next move. Well, the only winning move is another beautiful move, queen to d5, simply stepping back with a quiet move, one square. And again, you're offering your queen. But again, black cannot take it because of queen takes, rook e8 check. And it's the same thing. The only difference is that now black can block on g8, which makes maybe an even more beautiful checkmate depending on how you're evaluating the beauty of checkmates. So after queen d5, because the queen sacrifice cannot be accepted, black needs to deal with this new threat. Rook takes g7 check because the rook on f7 is pinned. So the king must move over, which is what happens, king to f8. And again, I encourage you to pause your video to try to find the next blow. At each of these steps, only one move is totally decisive. In this case, that move is rook takes g7. Again, offering a queen sacrifice and offering a rook sacrifice. If the rook is captured, then there's queen takes d7 because the rook is pinned here. And of course, white is totally winning on material, and white also has at least 3 different threats of checkmate in one. I think I stop at 3, but it's kind of harder to find a move that is not checkmate in one than a move that is in this position. So after rook takes g7, finally black does capture the queen. Queen takes d5. And if you want to pause your video one more time, this is your moment. It is rook to g8 check, sacrificing the rook to make the king move over. After king takes g8 here, we have rook e8 check. The rook must block, and rook takes f8 is checkmate. A beautiful mate reminiscent of the mate in the opera game from Paul Morphy. Well, I think you can understand why this is called the Ukrainian Immortal. If you've never seen this game, it is just so beautiful, so rich. What a wonderful winning combination. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games of the 1930s, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.